They summoned you just before midnight. You're the royal physician of Madrid in 1834, and though the king is already dead, your work is only just beginning. You're led through dim corridors to the private chamber where Queen Regent Maria Cristina waits, her eyes swollen with grief, her voice trembling with urgency. The task she gives you? Unprecedented, unspeakable, unholy. You steel yourself as you enter the royal bedchamber. There he lies, Ferdinand VII, a man so reviled by his people, so haunted by paranoia and power, that even in death, his presence grips the room like a vice. But it's not his twisted face that pulls your gaze. It's what lurks under the embroidered silk sheets, the grotesque symbol of his shame, his legacy, and his reign. Beneath that fabric lies a horror spoken of only in whispers. A deformity so profound, so unnatural, that historians would avoid naming it for centuries. They called it many things in private, a curse, a weapon, a punishment. But to the king, it was something darker still, the source of his torment and his identity. Stay with me, because what lies at the end of this tale is far more disturbing than any beginning. To understand how a monarch became a monster, you must start at his birth, a birth cursed not by magic, but by a genetic lineage steeped in rot. Ferdinand VII was the product of centuries of incestuous unions between Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons. Cousin married cousin. Nephew married aunt. The bloodlines twisted, thinned, and collapsed into themselves, until Ferdinand emerged in 1784 like the final consequence of royal arrogance. His parents, Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, were themselves first cousins, genetic dice already rolled with loaded hands. And the price of that gamble would be paid through their only son's most intimate suffering. Even as a child, something was off. As he grew, Ferdinand's body developed in ways no physician could explain. The anomaly between his legs began to stretch and swell, refusing the limits of anatomy or proportion. By adolescence, the court doctors were whispering about it in terror, but these whispers weren't confined to clinics. They echoed through the marble halls of the Escorial Palace, carried by giggling servants and disgusted nobles. Ferdinand's curse became public theater, his secret, a cruel punchline. One physician, years later, described it like this: a monstrous appendage, malformed beyond comprehension. Slender as candle wax at its root, monstrous and club-like. At its tip, resembling not a human organ, but an abomination from myth. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. In an era where refinement was valued over virility, where male beauty was drawn from Roman statues and classical ideals, Ferdinand's deformity marked him not as royal, but as beast that he was repulsed by himself. But worse still, he believed everyone else was too. His childhood unfolded like a slow descent into madness. His father, a passive monarch who preferred hunting to ruling, taught him indifference. His mother, cunning, carnal, and openly entangled with Manuel de Godoy, Spain's shadow ruler, modeled betrayal. Ferdinand absorbed these lessons alongside the mockery whispered behind palace curtains, and as the laughter grew louder, so did his rage that he began punishing servants for imagined slights. A page boy who stumbled upon him changing was publicly flogged and his family exiled. Ferdinand would not allow witnesses. His shame was a secret kept through fear. His paranoia took root early. He scrutinized every smirk, every curtsy, every blessing. As coded ridicule, he saw conspiracy in courtly compliments. Flattery was mockery in disguise. No gesture escaped suspicion. And so, surrounded by gilded mirrors and velvet lies, Ferdinand withdrew inward, into the only power he could control, cruelty. When he reached marriageable age, the physicians sounded silent alarms. His anatomy, they warned, made intimacy nearly impossible. Intercourse, if attempted, would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. One doctor wrote in a hidden memorandum, "It is not merely large. It is grotesque in shape. The extremity surpasses the width of a clenched fist. At rest it exceeds 10 inches. Erect, it grows into a weapon no woman should endure." Ferdinand didn't care. He had to marry. Spain needed an heir. So his craftsmen were summoned. Those silent artisans whose hands built palaces and saddles, and they were ordered to construct what court records would later euphemize as marital devices: cushions, padded rails, supports, instruments that blurred the line between intimacy and surgery. And then came the bride that in 1802. Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. A beauty with eyes full of fairy tales, Maria had heard only the propaganda, that her husband was intelligent, that he was desired, that he would lead Spain into a golden age. The wedding was magnificent. The people wept with joy. The palace glittered with promise. But when the doors closed and the royal bedchamber awaited, reality crept in. Custom pillows were arranged. Oils were uncorked. Implements of gleaming brass were placed at the ready. And the bride, still dressed in innocence, stared into the mouth of a nightmare. She screamed when she saw him. Screamed like a woman being devoured. "Monster! Monster!" she cried, as her ladies rushed to hold her. Witnesses claimed she nearly fainted. What Ferdinand revealed that night was not a man's pride, but a punishment made flesh. What followed wasn't a wedding night. It was a ritual of survival. Maria Antonia had to be sedated with laudanum just to endure it. Physicians hovered like surgeons, guiding the process with military precision. Pillows were adjusted. Flesh was oiled. Screams echoed down the corridors, and still, no air. The process repeated again and again. Ferdinand would summon his physicians. Maria would be drugged. The devices would be prepared. And the monarchy's desperate mission to procreate resumed like clockwork. Each attempt became more mechanical, more monstrous. Maria Antonia's mental health began to wither. She withdrew from public life. Her laughter vanished. The opiates increased. She was seen wandering the gardens, murmuring prayers with bleeding hands. At night, she wept into her pillow, begging God to undo the marriage. But Ferdinand? He blamed her. He claimed she was resisting him, that her soul, not his body, was to blame for their failure. He ordered restraints. Leather and silk, crafted by the same men who made his saddles. He timed their encounters to astrological events, moon phases, and the whisperings of mystics from faraway lands. He invited alchemists and Eastern men of wisdom into the palace, who promised rituals to unlock the fertility of the dragons. Rod. And when Maria Antonia finally became pregnant, twice, the palace held its breath. But both pregnancies ended in blood and death. The palace bells tolled with mourning, but no one wept with sincerity. In 1807, Maria Antonia, once the bright-eyed bride of Spain, died at only 21. The official record claimed illness. But behind closed doors, everyone knew the truth. She had died of despair, hollowed out by trauma, drugs, and a marriage that bled her dry, body and soul. Yet even her death couldn't free her from Ferdinand. Rumors crept through the stone walls, like mist, that she had been poisoned by her husband, who believed she'd sabotaged his lineage, that she had taken her own life, that she died not from disease, but from knowing too much. Her apothecary was found dead within days, a cryptic letter clutched in his hand, vanished forever by royal decree. And Ferdinand? He moved on. Within weeks, he was already shopping for another wife. This time, one proven to bear children. What he needed now was not love, but function. Not a partner, but a womb. In 1816, Princess Maria Isabel of Portugal, his own cousin, became his second bride. She was 19, radiant, and tragically unprepared. Her arrival at the Spanish court was met with pageantry and paranoid preparation. Palace physicians had already briefed her ladies-in-waiting on the unique requirements of the king. Custom cushions were unpacked. Strange contraptions resembling medical restraints were cleaned and oiled. Everyone knew what awaited the girl. Everyone except the girl herself. The wedding night was carnage. Screams echoed down stone halls. Furniture shattered. Blood stained the royal linens. Servants fled in terror. What occurred in that chamber wasn't consummation. It was assault dressed in silk. And when dawn came, Maria Isabel emerged not as queen, but as something broken. She developed a stutter, flinched when spoken to, woke screaming in the night. Palace physicians called it hysteria. Today, we would call it trauma. Ferdinand, blind to her terror, saw only treason. He believed her fear was a rejection of his royalty. He had her correspondence seized, her meals tasted, her rooms searched for signs of conspiracy. Spain was beginning to see what kind of king now sat on its throne. The monarchy's greatest duty, Producing an heir became a twisted obsession. The royal bedchamber turned laboratory. Physicians, midwives, even acrobats claiming anatomical expertise were brought in to assist. Every failure was followed by new solutions, stranger equipment, darker rituals, more invasive interventions. One physician's diary, unearthed decades later, described the scene. The king insisted on being observed. German doctors sketched diagrams of the act. French anatomists discussed angles. It was theater, grotesque, painful theater. Maria Isabel wasted away before their eyes. Her appetite vanished. Her eyes hollowed. She muttered to herself at meals, stared into mirrors as if expecting a reflection that might not come. Then came the phantom pregnancies. Her body, tricked by trauma, swelled as if with child, only to collapse in emptiness. Each false hope sent Ferdinand deeper into madness. When she finally died in 1818, just 2 years after marrying, her cause of death was listed as nervous exhaustion. But whispers told a crueler truth, that she had found the only escape left to her. Ferdinand's descent was no longer private. He ordered his second wife's body examined by multiple physicians, had her ladies-in-waiting interrogated, insisted she had been murdered by political enemies who wanted to rob him of an heir. But behind that smokescreen of rage was something worse. Relief, he was already searching for wife number 3. Maria Josepha of Saxony arrived in 1819. Older, more educated, and under no illusions, she brought with her a personal physician and an array of medical tools. Her marriage was not based on romance. It was an experiment, a procedure, a national necessity. The two shared no warmth, no joy, only schedules, clinical notes, cold attempts at creation. But even science couldn't overcome the monster in Ferdinand's bed. Sessions were documented like military drills. Position, duration, outcome. Maria Josepha recorded every detail like a physician until Ferdinand began to suspect she was one, that she was documenting him for spies, for enemies, for history. His paranoia blossomed anew. Spain, meanwhile, was imploding. The colonies had risen. Latin America declared independence one by one. The empire crumbled, and its king spent his days in bed, covered in silk and shame, trying to force a miracle from a cursed body. Ministers were dismissed over rumors. Servants arrested for glances. Whispered jokes became acts of treason. The Inquisition, revived by Ferdinand, now hunted those who dared mock the king's condition. And still, Spain waited for an heir. Then, against all odds, Maria Josepha became pregnant. It was a miracle. Or perhaps a final curse. Ferdinand descended into frenzy. Guards doubled. Priests summoned. Physicians imported from all across Europe. He had to protect the child, his last hope. But the queen's pregnancy began to fail by the 7th month. Her health declined. Her body buckled. Modern doctors would call it placental abruption. Ferdinand? He called for incense, alchemists, and exorcisms. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. It was a nightmare from the first scream. The baby, a daughter, died within hours. The queen, infected and crushed in spirit, followed 3 weeks later. Ferdinand kept their bodies unburied for days. He ordered revival attempts. Magical, medical, insane. When he finally let them go, he commissioned death masks and hung them in his chambers. The king slept surrounded by the faces of his 3 dead wives, but Spain demanded a future. And Ferdinand wasn't finished yet. There's still one more marriage, one more deception, and one final, horrifying twist that would seal his legacy, not as king, but as something far, far darker. By the end of 1829, Ferdinand had become a king in shadow, haunted, exhausted, but still clutching one obsession, an heir. The court whispered of his madness behind closed doors. Ministers came and went like ghosts. His nights were filled with laudanum, hallucinations, and whispered conversations with the death masks of his 3 wives. But one thing remained terrifyingly intact, his will. And so, a 4th marriage was arranged. This time, the bride was Maria Cristina of Naples, a distant relation and, more importantly, a woman carrying a secret. When she arrived in Madrid, already visibly pregnant, everyone at court knew the child inside her could not possibly be Ferdinand's. And yet, the king accepted it. Whether through denial, desperation, or delusion, Ferdinand embraced the unborn child as a divine gift. A miracle, a symbol that the heavens had finally answered his tortured prayers. In 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella II, and with that single birth, Ferdinand's legacy was reborn. Or so it seemed. The peace did not last. Ferdinand knew Isabella wasn't his. He saw it in her face, felt it in his bones. Yet he clung to the lie. For his dynasty, for Spain, for himself, his paranoia flared anew. Maria Cristina was no fool. She walked a tightrope, pretending devotion while maintaining her own secrets. Ferdinand watched her obsessively, had peepholes drilled into the walls of her chambers, would spend hours spying on her, even as she nursed or prayed. Servants whispered of the king's eye, ever watchful, like some demonic guardian trapped in a crumbling castle. Food tastings became elaborate rituals. He demanded tasters wait 30 minutes after sampling each dish, searching their faces for signs of slow-acting poison. Some tasters collapsed from exhaustion. Others disappeared. Maria Cristina began to unravel. She was constantly watched, her letters intercepted, her movements recorded. She wrote to family in Naples of being trapped in a glass cage, where even breathing felt dangerous. The king's paranoia became institutional. Guards were rotated daily. Ministers were subjected to contradictory orders. Those who corrected the king were labeled traitors. Secret passages were built throughout the palace so Ferdinand could spy and eavesdrop. Mirrors were installed at angles to catch reflections of gossip. Ferdinand no longer ruled a court, that he ruled a theater of fear. His obsession with Isabella bordered on the grotesque. Despite knowing she wasn't his blood, he both idolized and resented her. He studied her features, comparing them to paintings of himself, of Maria Cristina, and of every man who had ever stood near her. Artists were commissioned to create hyper-detailed portraits. He demanded genealogists and physiognomists proof. She carried his lineage. They didn't dare say otherwise. Behind their flattery were trembling hands and blank stares. Men writing fiction to preserve their lives. That Ferdinand's control deepened. He assigned servants to watch Maria Cristina's expressions as she wrote letters. He wanted to know how she smiled, how long she prayed, what books she read. Her personal diary, discovered years later, hidden behind a false wall, revealed her crumbling mind. She described herself as an actress who must never break character, even in my dreams. The king's madness now reached foreign shores. Ambassadors reported home about his erratic behavior. Diplomatic negotiations stalled. Royal families across Europe began to avoid Spanish alliances. Ferdinand's body had once crippled his marriage. Now, his mind crippled the nation. Every action became suspect. When Maria Cristina requested to repaint her chambers, he suspected it was a plot to hide weapons. When courtiers complimented her dress, he believed it was coded treason. Even religious rituals were filtered through suspicion. Her prayers? Secret messages to Rome. The cost of his madness was staggering. Fortunes were drained on spies, secret corridors, and surveillance. Equipment. Ministers left the government in paralysis. Spain's economic collapse accelerated. Revolts stirred in the provinces. And still, Ferdinand stared at his daughter, trying to convince himself she was his. But he knew, and that truth festered. By 1832, the king's health began to match his shattered mind. He developed tremors, violent digestive problems, and began rambling during state speeches. He would issue orders against imaginary conspiracies, accuse servants of invisible plots, and in the final twist of his paranoia, he began accusing Maria Cristina of poisoning him through touch. He demanded that she be medically examined before any contact. Court physicians, horrified but obedient, carried out these humiliating inspections in the king's presence. Maria Cristina, once a queen, now a prisoner, endured it all in silence. That Ferdinand's body collapsed slowly, that he wasted away, drifting between fever dreams and interrogation fantasies. Sometimes he called out to his dead wives. Sometimes he barked orders to arrest traitors that no longer existed. His court was no longer a government. It was a haunted asylum. And in 1833, at the age of 49, Ferdinand VII finally died. The official cause was gout. But everyone knew the truth. He had died of madness, of shame, of obsession, of the slow, soul-rotting poison that came not from enemies, but from within. The physicians who had served him, year after year, performed a final autopsy. What they found confirmed decades of rumor. His member, the infamous seventh, measured nearly 14 inches, tapering and twisting in ways too unnatural to record in public scrolls. There were signs of internal scarring, evidence of self-surgery. Ferdinand had, in his desperation, spent decades mutilating himself in secret, hoping to fix what nature had cursed that it never worked. Instead, it made him something worse than. Broken.it made him cruel. The preserved organ, yes, it still exists, was sealed away in the Vatican, buried under layers of secrecy, shame, and myth. Medical diagrams and documents too disturbing for public release were locked away, deemed unfit for any historian to publish. But they remain, and so does his legacy. Isabella II, the child he both claimed and denied, inherited his throne. But she also inherited a broken kingdom, bankrupt, humiliated, and smoldering in the ashes of his madness. Ferdinand VII is remembered not as a ruler, nor a reformer, but as a warning, a living symbol of what happens when power and deformity are left to fester unchecked. He sought immortality through blood. What he achieved was infamy through shame. And now, all that remains of him, hidden beneath silk, stone, and Vatican seal, is a monument not to monarchy, but to madness.